Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. Acts 15, verse 37 to 40. You know, one of the most painful passages to read in the book of Acts for me is this disagreement and separation between Paul and Barnabas because of Mark's apparent fear and abandoning of the mission. You can find this in Acts 13:13, and perhaps even Paul's belief that his mentor was getting soft and sentimental in his old age because Mark was his cousin. Well, it's comforting to know that Paul and John Mark are later reconciled. You can find evidence in Colossians 4, verse 10, 2 Timothy 4, verse 11, and Philemon 1:24. This issue of whether or not to base discipleship decisions upon past performance, future potential, or grace and truth is an important one. Discipleship is not easy. Who should you disciple and why? Have you ever been given a failing grade before? How did you feel? How did you feel when being compared to the knowledge, skill, and performance of others? Maybe more importantly, how would you compare grace and truth with performance-based evaluation? Let's see what the scriptures reveal about God's heart in this matter. We can find the foundation for this truth in Genesis 15, verse 6, where we learn that after hearing what God promised him about his children, even though he and his wife had long been unable to have children, Abraham believed God, and God counted that to him as righteousness. In other words, where Abraham knew himself to be incapable, he trusted God's promise to do for him what he had proved himself to be incapable of. In this case, it was having children. In your case or mine, it might be something else. After all, the gospel, the good news, is not about what we cannot do, but what the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ can do for us, and what he's promised to do for us should we believe in his Son. As we begin with Acts 15, verse 31 to 36, we can observe the beginnings of a global apostolic ministry. For some of you, that word global might be kind of new, but as a word that expresses activity that's based locally, but which has widespread or even global impact, it's a great word to describe what God is doing here through Barnabas, Paul, and the others. For while the first apostles remained in Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas were truly global in that they not only established a base beyond Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, but they continued to reach outward beyond where the gospel had previously been declared. And something which those who have entrepreneurial gifts and experiences will surely understand, when there was no apostolic job description, Paul and Barnabas sought the Lord's will and so learned of God's good, perfect, and pleasing will for them, much as Paul would later write about in Romans 12, verses 1 through 8. We can see, however, a clash developing between what Barnabas and Paul believed and disagreed about regarding discipleship, particularly whether or not discipleship should be based upon performance or upon grace and truth, as in Acts 15, verse 37 to 41, where they had falling out. Barnabas apparently took a chance on Paul because of his potential contribution, and not Paul's past record of legalism and opposition to Christ. Yet, Paul had not yet understood this revelation of grace and truth. That's quite likely why Paul did not show that same grace and truth towards Barnabas' cousin, John Mark. A very interesting thing for those of you involved in discipleship, however, is that God continued to try to teach Paul other truths, even as he was stuck on or even resistant to the lesson of grace. For through Paul's relationship with Silas and Timothy, Paul began learning to become all things to all men, as in Acts 16, verses 1 through 5. Here we see Paul choosing Timothy as his apprentice, and then quickly circumcising Timothy, who was half Jewish and half Greek, to avoid unnecessary opposition towards Timothy. Making the intellectual connections between the events Luke refers to here and what Timothy is later entrusted with, serving as Paul's representative and as a pastor of the church in Ephesus, Timothy learned greatly by watching, listening, learning, and helping Paul and Silas. Think for a moment about that bridge paradigm for discipleship. Can you imagine Timothy or even Paul going through the same process of growing a relationship and discipleship? You know, Watcher, believer, follower, servant, friend of God? How about you? Are you presently a watcher, believer, follower, servant of God? How are you doing with trusting God? Trusting a leader? Trusting God to work in and through you? Trusting a leader, or perhaps trusting God to work in and through others as He's worked in and through your own life? Well, stop and think about this for a moment or two. I still remember a conversation I had with my own pastor, Ralph Moore, years ago. The gist of that conversation was that our job as pastors was not to disqualify people, but rather to qualify them by equipping, empowering, and encouraging them. Jesus' own example of basing discipleship on grace and truth, particularly in the case of Peter, should be allowed great influence in our own discipleship decisions. I know that if Ralph had not tried so hard to qualify me, I probably wouldn't be where I am today. Who is God counting on you to qualify? And for what?